Tēnā koutou, nā mai haere mana rā koutou katoa. Good evening, everyone. My name is Neil Quigley. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this inaugural professorial lecture for Professor Samuel Charlton. Sam is an engineering psychologist with over 30 years' experience investigating issues in applied cognitive psychology and human factors. A founding member of the University of Waikato's Transport Research Group, his work has examined a range of road transport issues such as driver attentiveness and fatigue, drivers' perceptions of risk and speed, and the design of self-explaining roads. His NZTA-funded research into the effect of cell phones on driver performance led to changes in the Land Transport Road User Amendment Rule in 2009. In 2011, his research into acute error effects associated with moderate use of alcohol by drivers informed government policy and led to changes to the Land Transport Road User Amendment Rule in 2014. Sam's also interested in driving as skilled behaviour and how it can inform theory development in attention, decision-making, and automaticity of performance. Sam is internationally recognised as a leader in the areas of driver simulation and driver behaviour research. He's the editor-in-chief of the Elsevier journal Traffic Psychology and Behaviour. His work has been recognised with a Research Excellence Award from the New Zealand Automobile Association, Road Safety Innovation and Achievement Award from the New Zealand Local Authority Traffic Institute, and a Road Safety Engineering Award from the Road Safety Trust, and a 3M Traffic Safety Innovation Award. For many years, he was Technical Director of Human Factors and Training Analysis for the US Air Force Operational Test and Evaluation Centre. His work on human performance issues for the Global Positioning System, the Consolidated Space Operations Centre, and other projects earned him the US Air Force's Exemplary Civilian Service Medal in 1993. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure now to ask you to welcome to the podium Professor Samuel Charlton to discuss his recent work and findings entitled Getting There, the Psychology of Everyday Driving. Professor Samuel Charlton. Thank you.
Kia ora tātou, and welcome. I can't tell you how great it is to see so many friendly faces out there. Thank you for that introduction, Vice-Chancellor. And tonight I am indeed going to tell you about getting there, psychology of everyday driving. But first I have to tell you about getting here. There's some obligatory slides that describes where I came from before I arrived. Now, I didn't always study driver behavior. In fact, I studied everyday hamster behavior for my PhD. Something called instinctive drift or biological constraints on conditioning. Hamsters misbehave routinely, and in this case, bright lights and shock actually increase rates of lever pressing, which was an interesting sort of phenomenon, didn't fit the laws of learning, and that's because it triggered a hoarding response, an everyday behavior for hamsters, but perhaps not one that was in the textbooks. It turns out that if you reward hamsters with food for face washing, it actually decreases its future probability. So food for certain kinds of behaviors is a punisher. And I promised my wife I would show this slide. And here it is, Jean, the three-dimensional bell-shaped curve that formed a part of my PhD thesis, because I had this idea that certain responses could be conditioned with certain stimuli more or less readily, depending on the species and how sort of prepared they were or how sort of learning-oriented they were. But those were the Reagan-Thatcher years. There wasn't a lot of job prospects for someone studying hamsters. So I had to get applied pretty quickly. And my first position was at the Veterans Administration Medical Center researching recovery of stroke. Once again, the laws of learning didn't seem to apply because relearning, something that you already knew how to do but now have lost the ability to do, follows quite different rules. I did that for about a year or so, and then I hired on with a company called BDM, which I guess today would be called a think tank. Then it was called a Beltway Bandit. And we did a variety of different kinds of research, knowledge representation and expert systems for police agencies and security agencies worldwide. They were trying to profile people automatically. There still are. Some modeling and field testing for medical procedures. Wartime medical procedures are just topsy-turvy of peacetime medical procedures. You treat the least injured first so that they can return to duty. And a lot of task and skill sort of analysis, basic analysis work for satellite control systems. And that's who wound up hiring me away after 3 years, the people doing that satellite control. And I took a position with the Air Force Operational Test and Evaluation Center. We were responsible for testing all the new equipment that the Air Force wanted to buy. We tested everything, but the ones that I specialized in were these big one-of-a-kind kinds of projects like over-the-horizon backscatter radar or next-generation radar or the Consolidated Space Operations Center. But what took up most of my time was this thing, the Global Positioning System. I worked on that for about 6 years before we launched any satellites, and then after we launched 1, after we launched 3, after we launched 5, and so forth and so on. It's a very ambitious project, and it works today in spite of some really significant crew workload and situation awareness issues. But I'm not going to talk about, well, I will show you some pictures. Our job was to turn things that looked like that into things that looked like that. Very, very fancy. But then in 1995, I left that, and I moved to New Zealand with my family and started studying driver behavior. And people sometimes still ask me, why study driver behavior? To me, it's even more interesting than any of those things I mentioned. It's got it all. It's got it all for a cognitive psychologist anyway. It's got attention and memory and decision-making and perception and performance, all of those things. And what's more, we all do it. I don't have to teach anybody an artificial sort of task when they come into my laboratory. Everyone knows how to drive. They show up to my laboratory, and I can investigate that skill that they've already learned. And I believe that applied cognitive psychology or applied psychology of any sort really needs to improve people's quality of life. We have a responsibility to sort of give something back. And of course, if we get transport improved, that has huge benefits in terms of quality of life. It's number 3 in the household budget here in New Zealand. It's a very expensive proposition. It's about 40% of all CO2 emissions in New Zealand, and it's kind of difficult right now to use. You hear lots and lots of complaints. More about that later. The third reason is, of course, it's a significant public health issue. It is the number 1 cause of death for New Zealanders under 35 years of age. It's very, very expensive. About 88.69 million in Hamilton City alone in 1 year, and that's a tremendous cost that we could do without. But now, I want you to cast your minds back. I want you to think back to when you first learned to drive. It was bloody hard. This young woman, here's what she said about it. She says it rather well, I think. I drove on the road for the first time yesterday with my dad in the passenger seat supervising. I'm terrible at it. I'm having so much trouble with staying aware of everything that's going on, and cars are so bulky. It's so difficult for me to remain conscious of the fact that while steering, I not only have to keep myself away from the side of the road, but also the whole other half of the car that I'm not on. I feel like driving would be easier if I was in the center of the car for some reason as opposed to one side. Also, I have a tendency to oversteer on turns. Do you remember that? How difficult it was? A lot to do all at once. And for a cognitive psychologist, we tend to pat ourselves on the back, especially the ones that study driving, and say, yeah, it's really, really hard. This is what my colleague from Napier University, Stephen Stradling, said. I like it a lot. Driving is a skill-based, rule-governed, expressive activity involving balancing capability and task difficulty to avoid loss of control and ongoing real-time negotiation with co-present transient others to avoid intersecting trajectories while maintaining and enhancing your self-image. His point there is there's an awful lot going on with driving. It's a big part of our lives, but regardless of how difficult it seemed when you first started or how difficult it seems to cognitive psychologists, with practice, it becomes so easy you don't have to give it a second thought. Listen to what Mabel says. While I was driving to work today, I thought about how I was driving without actually thinking about it. I found it really difficult to go back to feeling the clutch, checking the mirrors, etc. in a conscious way. I just do it. And that's what we're calling everyday driving. You don't have to think about the journey. It's all about getting there. It's not about the journey. We simply get in the car and go. And some people, over the years, have pointed out everyday driving of this sort as a classic example of an automatic response or automatic task. Here's what Wheatley and Wagner a number of years ago said. Once the conscious decision is made to drive to work, the drive itself can be quite unconscious and automatic, and we may remember very little of the experience once we arrive at our destination. I'm sure you've all had similar experiences. Maybe, for example, you have to post a letter on the way home. You put it prominently on the dashboard or on the steering wheel, and you start the drive home, and the next thing you know, you pull up in the driveway, and you look at the letter, and you go, oh, shit. It's an automatic response. And a number of years ago, we called it driving without awareness, and we wrote, the sense of driving without awareness is an experience familiar to most drivers. A sudden realization that you have no recollection of the past several minutes of driving and that you have arrived at this point in the journey with little or no conscious attention to the surrounding traffic. As with other areas of skilled performance, many aspects of driving become automated with performance. And we've developed a model of how that might work, because that's an amazing kind of thing, that we do these complicated sorts of behaviors without realizing it or without thinking about it or without a recollection of it. And we suggested this tandem model was the reason, that you've got this operating process, this conscious process that needs only look in occasionally because it's supported by this big grunty monitoring process that's capable of doing error checking and handling most routine things. And as you practice, as you drive in more and more places and more situations, you actually build more and more stimulus response sorts of associations or skills or schemata at this monitoring level. It's a lot like an iceberg. So you've got this explicit attention maybe 10% of the time that you require when you're overtaking or learning to drive or navigating in an unfamiliar area, but 90% of the time you're sweet because you've got this big, grunty monitoring process under the surface. And so we said, this is the default mode for everyday driving, that most drivers, in fact, are driving without awareness most of the time. Nothing sort of prepared us, however, for the reaction in the scientific community for those kinds of statements. People said, well, this is inconsistent with most widely accepted views of automaticity. This is implausible that someone would have an infinite number of stimulus-response associations for driving situations. Another anonymous reviewer said, there's not a shred of evidence that driving is automatic. Mental workload during driving is never zero. Now, part of this issue came about because of how automaticity is studied. Soon after this idea of two forms of attentional processing, automatic processing versus explicit or controlled processing, was proposed by Posner and Schneider and Schifrin, it became studied almost exclusively in the laboratory using a very constrained set of tasks, very short duration, ballistic kinds of tasks. Those who study psychology will know when I say visual search, priming, and Stroop, exactly what that is. And yet, what we think of as everyday activities or automatic activities have not been studied well at all. Walking, bicycle riding, assembly line work, washing dishes, all too mundane to be studied. Can you consider these continuous chains of behavior as being automatic, or does it violate something? Well, rather than sort of wave a red rag at the bull any longer, we sort of changed our language. We stopped calling it automatic, and we started calling it for a while preconscious continuous control, which is a real big mouthful. I don't like it. And instead, we just started saying everyday driving. And now in the literature, when someone says everyday driving, we know what they're talking about, and they know what we're talking about. And a really nice example of this is a study by Hyman and colleagues a few years back. You can think about how you process information quite differently when you are engaged in pre-conscious continuous control. In this study, they hung money from a tree along a path where students regularly walked while talking on their cell phone or texting. None of the students bumped into the money. They all ducked to avoid the money, but none of them recognized it as money and stopped to pick it, because they were processing this information as an obstacle. They were processing it as a guidance cue rather than semantically, rather than according to its meaning. And we've demonstrated that in driving as well. A number of years ago in the simulator, almost 20 years ago now, we showed that adding a continuity line to the beginning of the overtaking lanes kept more drivers left. When we demonstrated that, just a couple years after that, it became the standard treatment for all overtaking lanes in New Zealand. These signs also, we spent a lot of time working on here in the Waikato and in other places in New Zealand, and we showed that these curve warnings, they're called chevron sight boards, that are placed at the tangent point of the curve, work really, really well at slowing drivers down, much better than those advanced warning signs with the little curvy arrow. And yet drivers don't remember seeing them. They can't tell you one was there, but it all has an effect on their behavior. It slows them down. In fact, it doesn't really matter what you write on the sign. It could be 85, it could be 45, it could be 65. What determines how much you slow down is the size of the sign. And there's a nice linear relationship between the size of the sign and the amount that you slow down. It works really, really well. In fact, we determined the same relationship, we determined the same relationship for these things, these urban-rural thresholds. A number of years ago, the LTSA back then came to us and said, what should we write on these signs? Some of these urban-rural thresholds are working really well, and some aren't working well at all. And we said, it doesn't really matter what you write on the sign. It's the size of the sign that matters. And even if they're blank like that, you get the same effect. You get the same effect. We set about doing an everyday driving experiment a number of years ago. This took a long time. This took almost 2.5 years to run, where participants came into the lab over and over and over and over again in our driving simulator, and they drove this road until they knew it like the back of their hand. It didn't take very long before they reported zoning out, driving on autopilot. And we said, we've captured it. We've got it in a jar. We've got everyday driving. What does it look like? Well, it's fast. We drive faster the more experienced we are. And there's decreased speed variability. We tend to lock in on one speed and try to maintain it. But the most surprising thing is change blindness. We don't notice. We stop paying attention to changes in the world. There was this big prominent building. It's really a noticeable building. And on some sessions, we removed it from the simulation. No one noticed. We added in signs for pedestrian crossings in places where there shouldn't be one. Nobody noticed. On some trials, we changed all the signs from English to German. Nobody noticed. What they did notice is when you mucked around with the guidance cue. They're very, very good at detecting changes in the center line, particularly when you take it away. The automatic motor program or the monitoring process, it has lost an important cue, and people notice that right away. What people also notice is police. Even in the driving simulator, where I can guarantee you no one has ever gotten a ticket, they immediately hit the brakes. Immediately. So we said, this is cool. Let's build one of these. Let's build an activation trigger, because that's what we were calling it. And so we had people flash their headlights, which also honked the horn, every time they saw a Volkswagen Beetle. Every time they saw a Volkswagen Beetle, they flashed their headlights. And they got very, very good at it. They could detect it a long way away and flashed it, their headlights. And in fact, the participants told us it quickly generalized. It became a part of their everyday driving behavior, and they were flashing their headlights at Volkswagen Beetles all over town. And to this day, I know one woman that was a participant in the experiment. I play badminton with her, and she tells me that every time she sees a Volkswagen Beetle, she reaches for the thing. And this is many years later. So with experience, the look and feel of the roads around us give us expectations about what's going to happen, what speed to choose, and what will happen. And we form those expectations very, very reliably. We did one experiment to see how good people were at categorizing the road types around them, and they are very good. Unfortunately, those road types that they choose don't always match well the road types that the traffic controlling authority or the road controlling authority is using. And that's where this conflict comes into into play. There are certain cues in these look and feel of these roads that are natural accelerators, that get people moving. Wide lanes, a forward view. You can see a long way, you go fast to get there. Smooth road surface, all of these things speed people up. Things that are narrow or irregular vertical elements are natural decelerators. And we can actually use that when we design our roads. But for the most part, most of our roads look identical. A New Zealand road is a New Zealand road is a New Zealand road. These roads all look very similar, and yet they all have different speed limits. And these roads look all very different, and yet they all have the same speed limit. We don't help our drivers very much in developing these good expectations about who's going to be there and what we want them to do. But a number of years ago, we had a rather large project, took a number of years, funded by what was then the Foundation for Research, Science, and Technology, or FORST, where we wanted to systematically manipulate the look and feel of a road. What we really wanted to do is take a set of roads, and roads we wanted people to go quickly on, collector roads or arterial roads, we wanted to make look and feel one way, and roads that are access roads around where people live, we wanted to make look quite different so they would slow down. We wanted to use these natural accelerators and natural decelerators. And we also wanted to increase the homogeneity of speeds. And what that means is everyone going the same speed, because homogeneity of speeds is safer. We've known that for quite a number of years. When everyone's moving the same speed, the safety benefits are huge. When people are moving at different speeds, it produces all kinds of undesirable behaviors like dangerous overtaking and tailgating and whatnot. And in fact, in our research, we routinely find heterogeneity of speeds, or non-homogeneity, if you will, two very, very different groups of drivers, some who want to go 10% or 10 kilometers an hour over what they think the speed limit is, and others who are more safety conscious and want to keep under 10% or 10 kilometers an hour under what they think the speed limit is. We call these fast movers and slow movers. And of course, you put them on the same road, and there's not these natural accelerators or decelerators present, and you get chaos. So we asked for volunteers, and the people that came knocking on our door was actually Auckland, then Auckland City Council, and they said, take Glen Innes. And we did, and we divided it in half with a control area and a treatment area. And as I said, the roads around don't look very different. This road on the left, Point England Road, handles about 7,000 vehicles per day. You can't tell it from that photo. And it looks identical with one of those access roads, one of those local roads that handle about 400 vehicles per day. So what we wanted to do is make them look different, right? And we came up with a design template with those natural accelerators and decelerators, those local roads or access roads. We gave lots of things to look at. We made people look closer to the bonnet of the car, and that slowed people down. We prohibited them from looking a long ways away. We narrowed the lane. We roughened the road surface. And for the collector roads, we removed things out of the forward visibility, and we added delineation so that all the road users have a place to be, because collector roads collect more than just cars. They collect pedestrians and bicycles and all the rest. And of course, we had to bring the people that live there along with us, so we had lots and lots and lots of open days. And no one ever questioned on my expense account why I rented a bouncy castle. I was waiting for the university administration to question that outlay, but of course they never did. It was really disappointing. Before the local roads, as I said, looked at just like the collector roads. After, they look quite different. The local roads on the top there, we've limited the forward visibility, we've removed the lines from the road. And the collector roads, we've added delineation and removed things out of the way of the forward visibility. And we gave them lots of things to look at on those access roads. We got the schools in the area to contribute art. The nice part about it was, though, was the effect on drivers' behavior. Here's our pre-treatment speeds before we did anything. And you can see that the access roads and the collector roads, people are going about the same speed, which is okay. It was all 50-kilometer-an-hour roads, of course. but some people are going 30 and some people are going 70. That's that heterogeneity of speeds. After those treatments went in, looky. Naturally, without signs, without enforcement, people naturally go the right speed, about 30 for our access roads or local roads, and about a little over 50 for our collector roads. Over the next 5 years, we achieved a 43% reduction in crashes, a 50% reduction in crash costs. That means the crashes that occurred were much less severe. And there was a young woman who was doing her PhD at AUT at the time, and she was using this as a case study and estimated that the health benefits, because more people were out walking and cycling because it felt safer, was probably 3 times the road safety benefits. As I said, no speed signs, no enforcement, just self-explaining roads. And over the years, we've collected a lot of field trial data and conducted experiments in the laboratory, identifying lots of these natural accelerators, natural decelerators. This one was a case where we took one of the most dangerous intersections in New Zealand and restricted the clear sight access as on the approach and slowed drivers down. 5 years before we did that, we had 24 serious crashes there, only 1 serious crash at that intersection in the 10 years following that installation. This was some delineation treatments that we tried on State Highway 1 from T-Rau south to Taupo. Significant safety gain, no increase in speed. Some signs. We did a rather systematic assessment of New Zealand hazard warning signs. Different signs work better than others. None of them work as well as a McDonald's sign, as it turns out. Signs are not the most effective thing we have in our toolkit. In fact, road markings are, and we spent a fair bit of time looking at road markings. This is a very recent one where we're trying using different kinds of lines as a continuous cue for what the speed limit is at any given moment. It's not all signs and lines, though. A number of years ago, this guy, some of you will remember him. This is Harry Deinhoven. He was then Minister for Transport Safety. I had been sort of bugging him for a while to eliminate or at least prohibit or restrict talking on cell phones by drivers. And he said, well, is talking on a cell phone any different than talking with a passenger? And so we put together a bit of research that showed, yes, Harry, it is quite different for several reasons. Talking on a cell phone is very different than talking with a passenger. And it leads to many, many more crashes. Talking on a cell phone does. And it doesn't matter whether it's hand-free or handheld. Another gentleman at the NZTA, this guy, Dr. Paul Graham, he's chief scientist at the NZTA. He came and talked with us a couple of years ago and said, we want to reduce the breath alcohol limit or the blood alcohol concentration in New Zealand, but we need evidence. We need evidence that it's going to be a safety improvement, that it's worth doing because it's really going to piss people off. And so we conducted 2 studies for him, one with moderate amounts of alcohol and one with moderate amounts of alcohol in social situations. And yes, 0.08 is significantly worse than 0.05, I can tell you. And what's more, impairment, the amount of performance decline increases over time, even if the amount of alcohol in your bloodstream stays the same. And that was a sort of novel and very important finding and received a lot of attention worldwide. We also, in the social drinking situation, found significant placebo effects. People had no idea how much they'd really imbibed, and people drinking the placebo were driving just as poorly as people drinking the alcohol. And more recently, this gentleman, Fergus Tate, Dr. Fergus Tate, who is the lead safety advisor at the transport agency, came to us and asked us, is it a benefit or is it a distraction to have one of these apps on your phone in your car telling you where you're going or what the speed is, right? They're getting a lot of questions about that, and so we did some research using a intelligent speed adaptation, intelligent speed warning device, and showed that if it's designed right and if it's located in the right place, there is a net benefit. Now, doing this kind of work is fun. I really enjoy it, but it has its drawbacks. As soon as you start talking about doing driver behavior research, people tell you, well, I know all about it. Let me tell you about driver behavior. The problem is, we don't always have clear insights into our own behavior, particularly because 90% of it you're unaware of. But people are more than happy to tell you what the real problem is. They'll tell you that it's the young drivers driving too fast. It's the old drivers driving too slow. It's the drink drivers driving stupidly. It's the tourist drivers driving badly. It's always the other driver. That's just the way we view the world. Another sort of drawback or challenge for us is that government policymakers aren't always interested in the causes. We are doing this research to find out something about the way the mind works and about how humans behave. They're not always interested in that. They would really just like to know where to put up the barriers to stop things from going pear-shaped. They want us to focus on the high-risk areas. And of course, we do that a little. One of the most recent ones is we raised the driving age because those young drivers, right? They're overrepresented. They're only 7% of the driving population, but they're involved in 14% of the fatal crashes. But we argued you might just as well want to reduce the maximum driving age because older drivers are overrepresented as well in the rates of intersection crashes and fatigue-related crashes. And of course, you often hear that we want to get tough on drunk drivers. And it's true that 16% of drivers treated at the Midland Regional Trauma Service here are over the BAC limit, but a better option would be to get tough on drunk walkers because 56% of pedestrians treated at the Midland Regional Trauma Service are over the BAC limit. And if you want to really get it, just outlaw driving in Northland and the Waikato because those are the areas that are with the greatest overrepresentation. But drilling down, as being a good academic, we want to really drill down to the area of highest risk, and it's women from Whangarei. The highest rates of collision across the two islands do come from Whangarei. Women report an incidence of at-fault collisions 2.5 times the national average. Of course, there's some very good drivers in Whangarei, too. And I guess what I want to leave you with, or what I want to tell you, is that, it's not the other drivers. It's all of us, and it's in the driving that we do every day, and that's where the answers are to be found, the answers about driving safely and the way the mind works. I need to acknowledge some people, of course. I need to acknowledge my family who are here tonight. Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to acknowledge some of my collaborators, past and present. I'll name 3 in particular: Bruce Taylor, Peter Bass, and Nicholas Starkey. And of course, there's a lot of people involved in this kind of work. All the support staff, our technicians, the steering group members, and all of these different projects, the postgrad students I've had and still have, and the postdocs, and the research assistants and participants, and of course the funders, New Zealand Transport Agency, New Zealand Automobile Association Research Foundation, and of course the University of Waikato, all of which I'd like to acknowledge. And that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much.
Kia ora tātou. I'm Alison Kirkman from the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and it is my real pleasure to thank Professor Charlton for his presentation tonight. Within the faculty, we pride ourselves on the undertaking of research that contributes to the betterment of all our lives, and Professor Charlton's applied research exemplifies the same. I'm going to point, just to repeat, to 3 examples, one that you didn't mention tonight, Professor Charlton. The first one is on driver fatigue, and why I'm pointing to these 3 examples is showing the whole span which you've shown tonight also across your whole career, and the impact across your whole career of your research. Professor Charlton's research on driver fatigue and impaired psychomotor performance in New Zealand truck drivers led to the promotion of fatigue management programs by government and their adoption by large sections of the trucking industry. I think of this research as I drive backwards and forwards across the Kaimais, And I suspect on this drive I'm not driving automatically in the way Sam has demonstrated tonight. And I also hope the truck drivers have been part of this program. Second, his research quantifying the distractive effects of mobile phone conversations and how they differ from conversations with passengers led to changes in the Land Transport Amendment rule, and has also been influential in law changes in other jurisdictions. Finally, the research I want to mention is his work with his colleague in the School of Psychology, Professor Nicholas Starkey, on the effects of different levels of alcohol on driving performance, which he's talked about tonight. All of Sam's research, which he's talked about tonight and which we know about from our reading, has had an impact in the actual lives of individuals, and I think that's a real achievement, Professor Charlton. It's traditional in inaugural lectures that no questions are taken from the floor. And as we conclude this part of the evening, I'm inviting everyone to join us for refreshments in the foyer. Once there, I'm sure Professor Charlton will be willing to discuss his research with you. But before we move to the foyer, can I ask everyone again to acknowledge and thank Professor Charlton for his engaging and insightful presentation. I'm sure that the points he's made tonight will remain with us as we go about our everyday driving lives. Thank you.